The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Hood, Texas, as Captain Sarah Mitchell walked into the hangar. 20 years of military service had taught her to read a room in seconds, and today, every eye in that hangar was fixed on her with something between pity and judgment. The smell of jet fuel and machine oil, a scent that had once meant home to her, now felt heavy, suffocating. Sarah was a decorated Apache helicopter pilot. Not just any pilot. The best pilot her squadron had produced in 15 years. Her record spoke for itself: 847 combat hours, 0 pilot errors, commendations from 2 commanding officers, and a reputation for keeping her crew alive in the most dangerous situations imaginable. But none of that mattered now. Not today. Colonel Marcus Henley stood in the center of the hangar, arms crossed, his face set in that expression she had learned to dread. He was a tall man, imposing, with the kind of presence that made younger soldiers straighten their backs. But Sarah had never been impressed by rank alone. She had seen too much, done too much, to be intimidated by a uniform. "Captain Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying across the metal space like an announcement. "A word in my office. Now." The other pilots pretended not to watch as she followed him. But she felt their stares. She heard the whispers. She had already begun to sense what was coming, like an animal feels the change in weather before the storm hits. Henley's office was sparse, military efficient. Photos on the wall showed him in younger days, prouder days, she thought. He sat behind his desk and didn't ask her to sit down. "I've received complaints," he began, his eyes never quite meeting hers. "Multiple complaints from your ground crew. They say you're difficult to work with. Demanding. That you make the men uncomfortable." Sarah's jaw tightened. She had heard these words before, whispered in barracks and break rooms. She was difficult because she demanded excellence. She was demanding because lives depended on every detail being perfect. And she made the men uncomfortable because she refused to laugh at their jokes when they crossed a line, refused to pretend she didn't notice when they questioned her decisions. "The men respect you as a pilot," Henley continued. "No one disputes that. But there have been incidents. Conflicts. I have a responsibility to maintain morale and cohesion in this unit. With respect, sir," Sarah said carefully, "I have never compromised a mission. I have never put anyone at risk due to personal conflicts." Henley finally looked at her. His eyes were cold, the eyes of a man who had already made up his mind. "That's exactly why I'm not grounding you from regular duty. You'll continue as a trainer. You'll work with ground crews. But as of today, effective immediately, you are suspended from flying Apache combat missions. No field deployments. No active duty in the field. Until this situation settles down." The words landed like a physical blow. Sarah had trained for combat her entire career. Flying the Apache wasn't just her job, it was her identity. It was what she was born to do. "Sir, if I may." "You may not," Henley cut her off. "This decision is final. You're dismissed." Sarah walked out of that office feeling like a part of her had been amputated. She was being cut away from her purpose, from the thing that made her who she was. And the worst part? She wasn't even angry. She was hollow. That evening, she sat alone in her small apartment in Killeen, a town just outside the base. The walls were bare except for a few military photographs. A framed picture of her Apache sat on the bookshelf, a shot of her helicopter against a desert sunset, taken during her last deployment to Afghanistan. She picked up that frame and stared at it for a long time. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother in Pennsylvania: "How's my brave girl? Miss you at Sunday dinner." Sarah deleted the message without responding. Her mother still saw her as brave. But bravery meant nothing when you were sidelined, when you were made invisible. The bar down the street from base was the kind of place where soldiers went to forget. It was poorly lit, smelled like stale beer and regret, and nobody asked questions. Sarah sat in a corner booth, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of her, when she heard the voice. Captain Mitchell. She looked up to see Sergeant James, J.T. Torres, one of the mechanics who worked on her helicopter. He was young, maybe 25, with an earnest face that reminded her of the way she used to look at the world before it started looking back with so much doubt. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. She gestured to the seat across from her. "What happened today?" J.T. began, then stopped. "I heard about the suspension. I wanted you to know something." Sarah said nothing, just waited. 3 of the complaints came from the same guy. Private Mitchell, no relation to you, I think. He's been spreading rumors. He told everyone you promised him special treatment during his pilot training, and when you wouldn't, you started riding him hard in the cockpit. He's lying, Captain. Everyone knows he's lying. And Colonel Henley, he's got his own problems. His daughter is in a civilian flight program, and there's been controversy about her getting special treatment. I think he's trying to prove he's tough on people, like he's overcorrecting because of his daughter's situation. This revelation changed nothing about Sarah's current predicament, but it explained something. It was easier to accept injustice when you could understand its roots. Henley wasn't being cruel because he thought she was guilty. He was being cruel because he was afraid of looking like he played favorites, afraid of his own vulnerability showing through. "Thank you for telling me," Sarah said quietly. "But it doesn't really matter, does it? I'm still grounded." "Maybe not today," J.T. said. "But this isn't over, Captain. Not by a long shot. You didn't do anything wrong. The truth has a way of coming out." After he left, Sarah sat alone again, watching the bartender pour drinks for other soldiers who didn't have their wings clipped. She thought about giving up. She had thought about it many times in her life, when her father told her that women didn't belong in combat roles, when she had to wash out other pilots in training who resented taking orders from a woman, when she realized that excellence alone wasn't enough to shield her from politics and petty resentment. But Sarah Mitchell had never been good at giving up. That's what the psych evaluations had always said about her. Determined. Persistent. Slow to accept failure. Weaknesses and strengths, depending on who was reading the report. She picked up her untouched drink and ordered a coffee instead. Tomorrow she would go back to the base. Tomorrow she would put on her uniform and pretend the ground wasn't shifting beneath her feet. And she would wait. She didn't know what she was waiting for. Just that something inside her, something that had survived every test, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt, told her this wasn't the end. 3 weeks after her suspension, Sarah sat in a different office. This one was on the 2nd floor of the base's administrative building, and it looked almost exactly like every other military office she had ever been in. The difference was the woman sitting behind the desk. Colonel Rebecca Waters was not from Fort Hood. She had arrived 2 days ago, and the scuttlebutt around base was that she was here to investigate irregularities in command structure. Which meant Henley had either gotten someone important in trouble, or someone important had decided to look into what Henley was doing. "Sit down, Captain," Waters said, and there was something in her voice that made Sarah's spine straighten. This was a woman who knew how to command respect without demanding it. Sarah sat. She had prepared herself for this meeting, practicing her words, but now that she was here, she decided honesty was better than preparation. Waters opened a file folder. Sarah recognized her own name on the tab. "I've been reviewing your record. 20 years of service. Multiple commendations. 0 flight incidents. Excellent evaluations from 2 previous commanding officers. Then you get assigned to Colonel Henley 6 months ago, and suddenly there are problems." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah said. "Tell me about the complaints. In your own words." So Sarah did. She talked about Private Mitchell and how he had struggled in training. She talked about how she had pushed him harder than other pilots because he had the skills but not the discipline, and discipline kept people alive in combat. She talked about how she had refused to give him special treatment, even when he had asked directly. He felt emasculated by you, Waters said. It wasn't a question. Possibly, Sarah admitted. But I couldn't let that change how I did my job. Waters closed the file and leaned back in her chair. Do you know why I'm here, Captain? No, ma'am. Because 3 days ago, we received a report from the Pentagon. An internal audit of Colonel Henley's command history. It seems this isn't his first personnel decision based on questionable evidence. 5 years ago, he relieved another female officer of duty. She challenged the decision all the way up the chain. The officer's record showed she was doing nothing wrong, but by the time the decision was overturned, her career momentum was destroyed. She took a medical discharge. And before that, there was a captain who reported sexual harassment by one of Henley's friends. Henley oversaw the investigation. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. It was anger, but also something else. Validation. The knowledge that she wasn't crazy, wasn't imagining things. I've also been speaking with people on the base, Waters continued. Mechanics, other pilots, medical staff. Every single one of them tells the same story about you. You're demanding. You care about details. You make some people uncomfortable because you won't accept anything less than the best. And you treat people fairly, regardless of whether they like you. So what happens now? Sarah asked. Now we do an investigation. A real one. We interview everyone involved. We look at the training records. We look at what Private Mitchell has been saying and to whom. And if what I suspect is true, we clear your record and initiate a review of Colonel Henley's command decisions. Sarah wanted to feel relieved. Instead, she felt tired. This was how the system worked, slowly, bureaucratically, with plenty of opportunity for the truth to get twisted along the way. The investigation took 2 weeks. Sarah continued going to the base every day, training new pilots on the ground simulator, doing everything asked of her while knowing that her reputation was being dissected behind closed doors. It was the hardest 2 weeks of her life. Harder than combat. Harder than physical training. Harder than the day she found out her father had died while she was deployed in Afghanistan. She saw Private Mitchell twice during that period. Once in the cafeteria, where he looked away when their eyes met. Once walking past her training classroom, where he stopped for just a moment and she saw the realization dawn on his face, that she was still here, still standing, and that the truth was about to become very public. The second week of the investigation, J.T. Torres asked her to meet him outside the base, at a coffee shop in Killeen. Sarah almost said no. Getting close to enlisted personnel during an investigation seemed like asking for more trouble. But something in J.T.'s voice made her say yes. I wanted to tell you something, Captain, he said, sitting down across from her. I gave a statement to the investigators. I told them what I know, that you've never asked for special treatment, never asked me to falsify records, never done anything wrong. But I also told them something else. What's that? I told them about the recording. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What recording? Last month, Private Mitchell got drunk at the same bar where you were that night. One of the other guys recorded him. He was bragging about how he was going to take you down because you made him look bad in training. He said Colonel Henley would help him because Henley had his own reputation to protect. The whole thing is on video. Sarah tried to process this. A confession. An admission of guilt on record. Why are you telling me this? The investigators should have found this. I just did find it. My buddy who recorded it didn't think it was important until I asked him about that night. Military guys don't always think about coming forward. But I did. And now the investigators have it. 2 days later, Sarah was called back to Colonel Waters' office. Your suspension is lifted, effective immediately, Waters said. You are restored to full flight status. Colonel Henley has requested a transfer. There will be a review of his command decisions, and depending on what we find, there may be additional consequences. And Private Mitchell? Sarah asked. He's being discharged. His false statements constitute fraud. His military career is over. Sarah nodded. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she just felt sad. A young man's career destroyed because he couldn't handle being pushed to be better. An older man's career derailed because he had prioritized protection over justice. And herself, vindicated, but still wounded. You can go back to flying, Waters said gently. Captain, you were never the problem. You never were. Walking back to her quarters, Sarah felt the weight lifting just slightly. Her wings were back. She was no longer banned from the sky. But the question that stayed with her wasn't about her vindication. It was about what came next. Because now that she was cleared, now that justice had been partially served, she had to face something harder than any accusation. 3 weeks after her reinstatement, Sarah stood in the hangar again. But this time, everything felt different. Her Apache helicopter, call sign Sharpshooter, painted with a woman's silhouette holding a rifle, sat waiting for her like an old friend. She ran her hand along the fuselage, and for the first time since her suspension, she felt something close to peace. Welcome back, Captain, her crew chief said. It was the same man who had been there before, but his tone was different now. Warmer. The kind of warmth that comes with respect finally being shown instead of withheld. Good to be back, Sarah said. Let's do a full systems check. I want to know this bird is perfect before we fly her. They spent the next 4 hours going over every inch of the helicopter. The rotors. The weapon systems. The communications equipment. The hydraulics. Sarah's eye for detail, the same quality that had gotten her in trouble, now felt like a superpower. She was making sure nothing had been neglected, nothing had been overlooked. She was reclaiming her authority over this machine. That evening, she sat in the briefing room with the new commanding officer assigned to replace Henley. Major David Chen was young, younger than Sarah, which was unusual, but he carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested he knew what he was doing. I've reviewed your file, Captain, Chen said. Twice. Because I didn't believe it the first time. Your record is extraordinary. Thank you, sir. I also talked to several of the pilots you've trained. They all say the same thing. You're demanding, but you make them better. More importantly, you make them alive. How many pilots have you trained who have served in combat? 14, sir. And how many of those 14 are still alive today? Sarah paused. She had never really counted it that way. All of them, sir. Every single one. That, Chen said, is not a coincidence. That's professionalism. That's someone who takes her job as seriously as it deserves to be taken. The last commander didn't understand that. I do. He leaned back in his chair. I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Are you going to be okay here? Or are you going to carry what happened with you? Sarah had asked herself this question every day since her suspension was lifted. The honest answer was complicated. But she tried to give Major Chen the truth. I'm still angry, she said. I'm still frustrated that it had to go this far before the truth came out. But I love this job. I love flying the Apache. I love knowing that I'm good at something that matters. Colonel Henley tried to take that from me, and he failed. That's not something I'm going to let define my experience here. Good, Chen said. Because I'm assigning you as lead trainer for our new pilot rotation. You'll be responsible for preparing 4 new pilots for combat deployment. And I want you to train them the way you always do, hard, fair, and with the expectation that they'll be excellent. Can you do that? Yes, sir. Over the next months, Sarah threw herself into training. The 4 new pilots, 3 men and 1 woman, were talented but raw. They made mistakes. They sometimes struggled with her exacting standards. But they also grew, developed, and eventually became the kind of pilots who would come home alive. The female pilot, Second Lieutenant Emma Reyes, reminded Sarah of herself at that age. Hungry, determined, constantly fighting the feeling that she had something to prove. One day, after a particularly intense simulator session, Emma asked to talk to her privately. "Captain, can I ask you something?" Emma said. They were in the empty pilot briefing room, just the two of them. "Of course. Did they ever try to push you out? Because you're a woman, I mean. Or just because of the way you do your job?" Sarah chose her words carefully. She didn't want to lie to this young woman, but she also didn't want to poison her with her own experience. "Both," she finally said. "But here's what I learned, and this is important. Some people will always be uncomfortable with women in combat roles. That's their problem, not yours. Your job is to be so good at what you do that your competence speaks louder than their discomfort. And the people who matter, the ones who actually respect professionalism and excellence, they'll see you." "What if the people who matter are the minority?" Emma asked. "Then you make sure the right people end up in command," Sarah said. "And you support each other. Women have to support women in these fields, because the system sure as hell won't do it for us." By the time the 4 new pilots were ready for their deployment rotation, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt since her suspension: pride. Pure, uncomplicated pride in work well done. She had trained them to be excellent. She had trained them to come home alive. But as the deployment date approached, Sarah found herself facing an unexpected problem. She wanted to deploy with them. She wanted to fly combat missions again. And she realized that what Henley had done to her, what had felt like the end of everything, had actually revealed something to her. She wasn't just a pilot. She was a teacher. She was someone who made other people better. She could be both. But right now, she had to choose. The night before the new pilot's deployment, Sarah sat in her apartment and wrote an email to Major Chen. She requested a position training pilots at the military academy. She requested it in a way that was clear but not final. She would do it for 2 years, and then she would reconsider. But she wanted to train more pilots. She wanted to ensure that excellence became the standard, not the exception. Chen approved the transfer the next day. Sarah got a note that simply said, "Smart choice. Come back and fly with us when you're done." On the tarmac, she watched Emma Reyes walk toward her Apache, fully loaded with ammunition and fuel for combat operations. Emma turned back and saluted. Sarah returned it, tears in her eyes that she didn't bother to hide anymore. She had been banned from flying. But what she had discovered in that dark time was something worth more than any combat mission. She had discovered who she really was. And she had discovered that being grounded, sometimes, was the only way to learn to fly higher. 2 years passed. Sarah was content in her role at the military academy, training the next generation of pilots. She had settled into a life that felt purposeful and meaningful, though part of her still missed the roar of the Apache's rotors, the rush of combat flying, the knowledge that she was protecting people on the ground. The scandal involving Colonel Henley had mostly faded from the daily conversation at Fort Hood. He had taken his transfer and disappeared into a staff position at another base. The reviews of his command decisions had been completed, quietly, and filed away in the kind of way that suggested powerful people had decided not to make a bigger issue of it. Sarah had made peace with this. The military bureaucracy moved slowly, and justice was often incomplete. She was alive, she was flying, training pilots to fly, and she had the respect of her peers. That was enough. Then, on a Tuesday morning in May, she received a call. "Captain Mitchell. This is Admiral James Blackwell. Can you come to my office at the Pentagon? I'm sending a car." Admiral Blackwell was one of the highest-ranking officers in the military. Sarah had no idea why he wanted to see her. The call had come through official channels, not a casual request, but a formal summons. The car arrived within the hour, and 6 hours later, Sarah was standing outside the Admiral's office on the E-ring of the Pentagon. A secretary ushered her in. Admiral Blackwell was a tall black man in his 60s, with the bearing of someone who had spent his entire life in military service. His office was decorated with commendations, photographs, and memorabilia from a long career. He gestured for her to sit. "Captain Mitchell, I appreciate you coming on short notice," he began. "I've been reviewing a matter that concerns me, and your name came up. I wanted to speak with you personally." "Of course, sir. Tell me about your experience with Colonel Marcus Henley." Sarah took a breath. She had told this story before, to investigators, to Major Chen, to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts. But there was something in the Admiral's face that suggested he wanted more than just the facts. He wanted to understand. So she told him. All of it. The suspension, the investigation, the vindication. She told him about the false accusations, about her suspended flights, about sitting alone in a bar wondering if her career was over. She told him about J.T. Torres and the recording that proved everything. And she told him about the 2 years since, training pilots and rebuilding her life. When she finished, Admiral Blackwell was quiet for a long moment. "Do you know why I'm asking?" he said finally. "No, sir. Because there's a pattern. Henley has been moving from base to base for 15 years, and every time he leaves, there's a trail of people like you. Talented soldiers whose careers were derailed by questionable decisions. Women, mostly, but not exclusively. People who threatened him in some way, usually because they were competent and didn't need his approval to know their own worth." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Why hasn't anything been done? Because protecting him was easier than investigating him. He has friends in high places. His father was an admiral. His uncle was a senator. People didn't want to look too closely at his record because of what they might find. Blackwell leaned forward. "But I'm looking now. And I found something interesting." He turned his computer screen toward her. It was a document, a formal complaint filed by a captain named Laura Hayes in 1998. Hayes had been relieved of her command under circumstances that sounded eerily similar to Sarah's. But there was something else. The complaint had been marked as resolved and filed away. There had been no investigation, no vindication. Just a quiet dismissal. Laura Hayes, Blackwell continued, left the military 2 years after this incident. She went to work for a private defense contractor. She's done well for herself, but she should have been a decorated officer. Instead, she was erased. There were other files. Lots of them. Women and men, spanning almost 2 decades. Some had left the military, their careers derailed. Some had stayed but transferred to lesser positions. All of them had something in common: they had been in the way of Colonel Marcus Henley's advancement. "I'm telling you this," Blackwell said, "because I need witnesses. Real witnesses, willing to testify. Not anonymously, not in some quiet bureaucratic review, but in a formal hearing. Henley's being brought up for promotion to brigadier general. In a normal process, he would likely get it. But I've requested that this promotion be delayed pending a full review of his command history. And for that to happen, I need people to stand up and be counted." Sarah's mind raced. Standing up meant opening everything up again. It meant revisiting the worst period of her career. It meant potentially making enemies of people who had accepted the quiet resolution. "What if I say no?" she asked quietly. "Then Henley gets promoted. He moves into an even higher position of authority. And he continues to destroy careers. But you go back to your academy post, and life goes on. That's a valid choice, Captain. I won't judge you for making it." Blackwell stood up and walked to the window. His office overlooked the Pentagon's courtyard. "I was where you are once," he said. "I had a commanding officer who made my life difficult. Not because I wasn't competent, but because I was too independent. I didn't need his approval. So one day, I did the same thing you did, I stopped caring about his approval and just focused on being excellent. And eventually, he had to accept it or look like a fool. He turned back to face her. But not everyone is as stubborn as us, Captain. Not everyone can keep flying when someone's trying to clip their wings. Some people break. Some people never recover. That's why I'm here, doing this work. Because the system won't police itself, and if people like us don't stand up, nothing changes. Sarah thought about Laura Hayes, working in the private sector, her military career cut short. She thought about the other names in those files, officers and soldiers who had been erased because they didn't fit someone's vision of what they should be. She thought about Emma Reyes, her student, flying combat missions knowing that the system could turn against her at any moment for any reason or no reason at all. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Blackwell smiled. It was a small smile, but it held something like satisfaction. "Just tell the truth. The same truth you told me today. In front of a board of review, on the record, where your words can't be dismissed or filed away. Can you do that?" The hearing was held in a formal room in the Pentagon, with the kind of official gravity that comes with high-level military reviews. Sarah sat at a table facing a board of 5 senior officers, including Admiral Blackwell. Across the room, Colonel Marcus Henley sat with a military lawyer. The prosecutor, a formal, methodical officer named Captain Richardson, guided Sarah through her testimony. She described the suspension, the investigation, the vindication. She talked about her record, her qualifications, her commitment to excellence. And then, when the lawyer for the defense tried to suggest that she might have provoked conflict through her demanding nature, Sarah said something that surprised even herself. "Yes, I'm demanding. I'm demanding because people's lives depend on me. And I would rather be demanding than apologetic for wanting perfection when perfection keeps people alive." The board took a recess, and when they reconvened, 4 other witnesses had been called. Laura Hayes, the captain from 1998, testified. She was older now, successful in the private sector, but there was still a wound visible in the way she talked about her military career. Major David Chen, Sarah's previous commanding officer, testified about her excellence. J.T. Torres, now a sergeant, testified about the culture Henley had created. And then, unexpectedly, Emma Reyes testified. She had been pulled from her deployment to serve as a witness. She talked about how Sarah had trained her, challenged her, made her better. And she talked about the fear she felt as a woman in the military, knowing that competence alone might not be enough to keep you safe from the system. The hearing lasted 3 days. On the final day, the board announced its decision. Colonel Marcus Henley's promotion to Brigadier General was denied. His record was placed under formal review, and he was being reassigned to a non-command position. Additionally, the board recommended a formal apology be issued to Captain Sarah Mitchell, and her file was to be expunged of all references to her suspension. More than that, the board recommended that all of Henley's previous command decisions be reviewed, and that any officers who had been harmed by questionable decisions be contacted and offered the opportunity to reinstate their cases. Walking out of the Pentagon, Sarah felt strange. She had won. Justice had been served. And yet, something felt incomplete. Admiral Blackwell caught up with her in the parking lot. "You did well in there, Captain," he said. "Thank you, sir." They walked in silence for a moment. Then Blackwell turned to her directly and said something that would echo in Sarah's mind for the rest of her life. "Fly your helicopter again," he said. "That's an order." Those 5 words, short, simple, and impossible to misinterpret, changed everything. Sarah returned to Fort Hood. Major Chen was waiting for her when she arrived, with orders transferring her back to active flight duty. Emma Reyes was still there, back from her deployment, and together they walked to the flight line. Sarah's Apache was waiting, freshly maintained and ready. She did her pre-flight check the same way she had done it 1,000 times. Rotors. Systems. Communications. Weapons. Everything perfect. Everything prepared. When she fired up the engines and felt that first vibration, when she lifted off the ground and the world fell away beneath her, something inside Sarah Mitchell that had been broken began to heal. She wasn't flying away from something anymore. She wasn't running from injustice or hiding from pain. She was flying toward something. She was flying toward her future. She was flying toward the knowledge that she had stood up, told the truth, and the world had listened. Not because the world was just. Not because the system was perfect. But because people like Admiral Blackwell had decided that enough was enough. Because people like J.T. Torres had stepped up to tell the truth. Because women like Laura Hayes and Emma Reyes had found their courage. From 3,000 feet above Fort Hood, Sarah looked down at the base, at the small figures of soldiers moving about their business. She thought about Colonel Henley, his career in ruins. She thought about Laura Hayes and the career path not taken. She thought about Emma Reyes and the challenge of the military for women who refused to be small. And she smiled. Because the 5 words the Admiral had spoken, "Fly your helicopter again," weren't just about flying. They were about permission. Not the permission to do something she was qualified to do, but the permission to take back her life from the people who had tried to steal it. She was a pilot. She was exceptional. And she was never going to apologize for either one. The rotor blades cut through the Texas sky, and Sarah Mitchell flew on, not as a woman who had been banned from flying, but as a woman who had discovered that no one could clip her wings, no matter how hard they tried. The Apache banked to the south, toward the horizon, toward tomorrow, toward every mission still waiting to be flown. And in that moment, Captain Sarah Mitchell was exactly where she belonged.